Hello. Okay, cool. Hi. Hi, everyone. My name is Harlo, and thank you very much for joining me today to have a discussion about source communication under lockdown. And before I get into the introduction, I just want to say that the format of this talk is like a little bit storytelling with some tips and tricks mixed in. And it's the culmination of past almost 2 years that I've spent as a digital security consultant in the journalism space, working with a variety of investigations, in print, more traditional media, digital, documentary film, and podcast at this point. So by way of introduction, I am with Freedom of the Press Foundation, and we are a nonprofit based out of the United States, a 501c3, but we do have presence everywhere on the globe, where we do three things. One is we have an engineering team that shepherds, among a couple of other projects, our crown project, which is called Secure Drop. This is a newsroom appliance that you might have seen at a variety of major newspapers, of which you see here, and even now here, growing all over, where from a technological perspective, we can facilitate communications between potential sources, members of the public at large, potential whistleblowers, and the growing number of newspapers of which you see right here. And this goes over like the Tor network. It's one of the constellation of tools that leverages that anonymity system. The other thing that we do is advocacy, a lot of advocacy. So the brand new look of the US Press Freedom Tracker, which is our own little newsroom where our reporters track down and document incidents within the United States where members of the press have had their right to report trampled upon. And we do treat it not only like a newspaper, but also it's API driven. And this allows anyone to, work on this particular data if they want to get statistics about incidents and work them into their own reporting or, whatever. And finally, there's my team, of which I'm very proud, which is our digital security and training team. What we do is we write a lot of content. So if you do visit freedom.press/training, you'll see the work that my friends and I have created that give handy guides about how to use a variety of tools that we're going to talk about today, and even some that we won't. And also, we are on the ground. And actually, this is why lockdown was really hard for us. We do an immense number of trainings with journalists across the globe. I believe even over lockdown, we clocked over 1,500 journalists that were trained through our programming. We do consultations and security audits for organizations large and small, and consultations for individual journalists, freelancers, you name it, we're there. So I said I was going to tell this as somewhat of a story. I agonized exactly about how I should do it, but this is kind of what I figured I should do because it is Friday. And so I want to take you through a couple of Fridays that I experienced over the past couple of years. So Friday the 13th, 2020 was the last day I was on an airplane before lockdown. And I was coming from a client in another country that had issues with Secure Drop, and they needed, someone to come in and work with that. And so my team and I flew out there to Canada to meet them. And, we worked on Secure Drop, but this was at the very, very beginning of lockdowns. And so this was an incredibly hard trip to make because people didn't know what to do. The Secure Drop installation was on their premises. We visited them in their office. We poked around with their servers and stuff. But then halfway through the trip, when we had heard that lockdowns were going to be coming, we did two things. One, we definitely scrambled and got on Expedia and canceled the remainder of our Airbnb and got flights home because we didn't want to be kept abroad. And also we discussed what is going to happen to their secure drop, which was on their premises, but maybe next week they were going to close their doors and they didn't know when they were going to open up again. And so what's interesting about this is that the secure drop system means, and if you've ever had the pleasure of using it, no, it's great. But if you have ever used it, you'll know that it requires a lot of physical access to servers that need to be maintained, that are usually kept in an office securely in order to mitigate any potential legal issues. And also an air gap system with a very, very precious key on it that can be used to decrypt submissions that have been sent securely to the system. And there ideally is only supposed to be one of these keys that people share communal usage of in an office in order to check their submissions. So for an office that was going to lose all of their staff and send them home, we did have to kind of scramble around what we would do in the event of no one ever being able to actually physically go in and touch that again. So what we did was we scrambled from lessons learned on that particular job, and putting our heads together to think around threat models. We came up with an advisory about what whistleblowing or source communications with whistleblowers is going to look like when people are remote. We actually kind of rolled back a lot of our more stringently held guidelines for secure drops, such as making sure there's only one copy of that one key. Instead, we put together systems where people could share keys and take home a laptop to safely decrypt that on an air-gapped system, meaning a computer that literally just never touches the internet. But this was, kind of it was such a learning moment for us all, I believe, because this was the first time where it became abundantly clear to me that we take so much of this work for granted when we are working with confidential sources. There's a lot of trust that is bound with the physicality of life, of our day-to-day, that we didn't necessarily realize would just be gone in an instant. So as everyone transitions into work from home mode or whistleblowing from home mode, there were a lot of minutiae that we had to just kind of talk through. From an enterprise perspective, there are a lot of affordances that an IT department is going to make in order to allow you to access a system like SecureDrop that uses the Tor network. Historically, enterprise offices are very, very reluctant to allow Tor network onto their basic their corporate networks. And I would be very curious, by show of hands, if anyone knows that particular pain that I'm talking about, where somebody says, it's absolutely impossible for you to use Tor in this building. But given those restrictions, when people go home, obviously you can't necessarily, you can't necessarily tell people what they can and cannot do on their home network, because that is a relationship that they have with their own cable companies. And the only thing that you do in corporate situations is hopefully give people access to a VPN that they can use in order to access, their email or the content management system by which they file or other assets on the company. And so if that corporate VPN was configured in such a way to block Tor traffic, that meant that there were a whole bunch of SecureDrop instances that, were unattended to, because there was no one that was actually allowed to check their SecureDrop submissions from their own homes. And so in addition to understanding this problem, and we didn't necessarily know that that would be a problem until people started to just ask us about it and ask us for workarounds, did we come up with protocols for petitioning your IT department for solutions that would allow them to have access to the Tor network under certain circumstances, even if they were using their corporate VPN. We also definitely instructed people on, how to use the operating system Tails, which is already part of Secure Drop. It's the incognito system USB stick that looks entirely crazy, I know, where you boot into an operating system separate from the one that is on your computer in order to do all of your networking over Tor and another host of other properties. But that was one particular, learning curve that we actually had to kind of get over. And so we also realized that in addition to those who were working in Secure Drop land, my team, my lovely team here, I love them so much, and without them, I would not have gotten through this pandemic at all, actually, decided to keep ourselves connected in a variety of ways that were integral also to our job, such as talking about how journalists can work from home safely and adding guidelines here. Some of our key takeaways, not only for Secure Drop, but for anything where you are, working on sensitive stories from the comfort of your own living room. Obviously, here's some tips. Full disk encryption, meaning that when you shut down your computer is now encrypted, and so no one can tamper with, modify, otherwise view any of the, the files that you have there within reason. We also kind of encourage people to, get into the habit of shutting down when going away from extended periods of time. And that definitely does mean not leaving your computer on literally for weeks at a time as you, go to the grocery store and walk your dog while social distancing and things like that. And also understanding the rise of the platforms as we saw via the astronomical rise of and proliferation of using video conferencing tools to get the most basic things done, which I'm sure you all understand. So does anybody remember this New Yorker cartoon? I think this is actually a picture of me. But it's all of us, actually. We got into the habit, well, minus the martini or whatever, but we got in the habit of, showing ourselves as being entirely put together from the vantage point of that camera that is on our that comes out of our computer, but meanwhile we are just, as I like to say, a Zoom core hot mess everywhere else. And from a digital security perspective, this actually did come into play in ways I thought were pretty interesting. So at the beginning of lockdowns, when Zoom realized that there was a huge uptick in their user base, because of its convenience and because of its availability, they did make some claims. I wonder if you remember. They made some claims that were actually untrue regarding their ability to support end-to-end encrypted conversations for parties over the platform. In their marketing, they actually did say that calls were end-to-end encrypted, which was, at that time, a lie, and they were actually kind of bad faith capturing a moment where this was a cool term to use in security and just applying it to the fact that they had regular encryption. And so because we all found ourselves in the security community relegated to talking to people over platforms like Zoom, and actually I do see a couple of people in this room who know why that was particularly painful for us, because Zoom is not typically a product that the people of the old days of the internet freedom scene would ever think of using, but yet we found ourselves having to. Some of us got a little bit curious, and some of us started asking questions. So in March of 2020, our esteemed colleagues Micah Lee and Yael Grauer actually wrote a piece on The Intercept where they, after doing their research, discovered exactly why Zoom was abusing the term end-to-end encryption in their marketing materials. And those findings were actually pretty damaging. in addition to discovering a number of vulnerabilities in, the waiting room feature, for instance, that allowed people to abuse that and eavesdrop into conversations that they were not supposed to participate in, which were fixed. They also did realize that there were, depending on the servers that you were connecting to, weak keys or weaker keys to encrypt those the communications in that session, which actually meant that, depending on where you were connected to a Zoom server, it was possible that your communication would be entirely downgraded and thus be able to be eavesdropped upon. Geopolitical stuff notwithstanding, because I'm not going to say that American Zoom servers are better than Canadian or Chinese Zoom servers, not in this talk anyways, but what the takeaway is that there were a lot of claims made by Zoom regarding people's security that were absolutely unfounded in the infrastructure of the platform itself. Sorry, this is so low res. I wasn't expecting that. But that said, Zoom did definitely, take our criticisms to heart, which was pretty cool. And I actually don't mind Zoom anymore because sorry, gosh, yeah. But okay, but we can talk about it later. I did find, I don't prefer Zoom, but I did find that their responses were admirable. In addition to fixing the waiting room insecurities, which were patches that they rolled out very, very shortly after researchers had discovered it, they did a couple of things that I found admirable. They actually hired, or pretty much acquired a team called Keybase, based out of New York, that were pioneering in end-to-end encryption for media protocols, among other things. And they pretty much took this company and put them to task into accurately implementing features like end-to-end encryption into this platform. And also they were incredibly transparent because, or not incredibly, but as transparent as you would expect a corporation of this size to be, because they did realize that they had to perform accountability in order to in order to keep their standing as a player in this space that was growing exponentially by the day. I hope you all remember what it felt like to just when you realize that your life literally was on Zoom every day. You can only imagine how Zoom felt with that burden on their shoulders, having to deal with that from an infrastructural level. So now Zoom does offer end-to-end encryption, which is great, and they have for a little bit of time. My critique on that is that the way to enable end-to-end encryption is not as transparent as it should be, and so I guess I'll let these slides kind of guide you through that. Should you need that? Should you need to do so? You cannot enable an end-to-end encrypted conversation in Zoom, by default from that room where you start up the meeting. Also, it still goes to say that unless you've configured it in a certain way, your calls over Zoom are not going to be end-to-end encrypted. They're just going to be, adhering to the regular standards of encryption that we would expect from any service that we use. But they do allow it, which is great. And the way that you do it is you actually have to go to zoom.us. You have to log in to your Zoom account and go to your profile. And then from your personal profile settings under security, you scroll down a little bit, and then you toggle this on. So in terms of the source communication aspect of it, this is great because it means that no matter what server you're on, ideally you should have the protection of end-to-end encryption. However, using end-to-end encryption does mean that people have to have Zoom accounts. And so there is a little bit of linkability if you're going to be using Zoom for a certain type of communication. There's certain types of communications with sources that don't necessarily require absolute anonymity, and we'll talk about some of those tools in a moment. But for those that do not, and you just need to meet people where people are, on the Zoom, as we say, then this is exactly, like what you need to do. Optionally, although recommended, is to make end-to-end encryption your default type for when you start up a meeting. So that means that, that can't be changed, and also, once again, like you can't allow like non-registered Zoom users into a meeting room. And the good thing about this, operationally, is that this setting is per user, per account. So if you have an organizational account where several people on your team have their own individual Zoom accounts at your organization that are equally licensed and paid for, perhaps you have one account that that is like open to all, where you can have public events and blah blah blah, and like do regular meetings. But if you do have to have more secure conversations, you can have certain accounts that you create those meetings for, where end-to-end encryption is enforced. So that was like a very sad lesson I learned sitting at my desk all alone in lockdown. You have to also verify your phone number when you enable this setting, just, so you know. Okay, so here's another Friday. So the first couple of months of the pandemic were very surreal, and also I at least definitely felt that it was just going to end and I'll be able to get on a plane again. But no, that didn't happen, and everything became like the new normal. And so because I was so depressed, but whenever I'm depressed, I go to work, my colleagues and I decided to start a Zoom or a Twitch stream where we talk about these things. And what we wanted to do, by the way, twitch.tv/freedom of press. By the way, what we decided to do is we decided to explore the topics of our day-to-day job in lockdown with people that we thought were pretty interesting. And so on our first episode, which was that Friday, the May 15th, we talked to we talked to a couple of folks in a variety of media industries about how they were handling sensitive communications that need to take place from reporters or editors or investigators' homes. And these conversations actually tended to fall down upon what an IT department in a large organization would do to prepare someone in their own home. We can talk about how bandwidth shaping works and how you can actually get reliable internet in your own home when you live in the hood, but that's not the point of this talk. But ultimately, a lot of people had to take on their own sysadministration roles in their own houses. You can imagine it's a little bit harrowing for someone who's working a national security beat to all of a sudden have to rely upon the same internet that that their children use for their homeschooling to have certain types of conversations with what are supposed to be confidential sources. The reason why is because in a typical home, your internet service provider, who you will pay money to bring cable into your home, will be very nosy about the type of transactions you're making over the internet. They will know when you are on Zoom, and they will know when you're on Netflix, and they will know when your children are at school, etc. And so a lot of the more, diligent and perhaps even paranoid of the reporters that I had spoken to were really, really worried about two things. One was that particular nosiness of their ISPs, understanding exactly how much time they were spending on any particular platform to communicate with sources, and also how to protect their traffic from the clumsier members of their home as far as the internet is concerned, such as, children who will play, games on their iPads all day and bring viruses onto the network. So one thing that we didn't publish any of this, but we did some, that looks horrible. We did some research on it, and were able to consult people on were, simple-ish ways to outfit your home in order to optimize it for this type of, becoming your own IT infrastructure in-house. This is an example of an Ubiquiti access point that supports mesh networking for people with, apartments with weird layouts, such as the typical New York City railroad apartment where you live on one end and your roommate lives on the other end, and in the middle there's a bathroom, and it's really sad, but that's your life now. Introducing mesh networking in order to properly distribute and properly shape network trafficking and associate different devices to, to different access points that are strategically placed around the home was one example. And there are other examples that I won't mention, but this was just, the one that I had the most experience testing on. Also, in terms of the surveillance that people were worried about via their ISPs, there was a resurgence of the pie hole, which is a very cheap to put together device and accompanying software package that allows you to, to pretty much sinkhole any traffic that would potentially be surveillance on your network, so as to protect you from unwanted ads and trackers if you are, doing more risky research or without, letting your ISP have too much insight into what that traffic is. And so that's just kind of an example of how it not only blocks ads and stuff like that, but it takes out a lot of the guesswork for configuring for thwarting your very nosy cable router that comes out of the box. But that said, there's a lot of inequity, and I've only spoken to a couple of reporters that actually went the distance in order to do this. There was definitely a lack of guidance in a lot of the newsrooms that we talked to about how to do this. And also this is something that does not come for free. People do need to have a budget, and there were some organizations that actually did have work from home budgets in order to encourage people to take this type of security into their own hands. But for every one organization that did, there would be 20 that definitely would not. And so this has to be something that you really are encouraged to do. And so finally, even for those that I did ask if they had the proper support, the follow-up question was did you actually do it? No, didn't do it. So, okay, here's another Friday. So let's things continue on like that for a while. And I'm starting to get used to it. I'm starting to be creative with the tools that are at hand. And I start to speak to a lot of, I was incredibly busy over this time period. I worked with a large amount of investigative units and documentary films, and it was really satisfying. Friday, May 28th has absolutely no relevance other than it is a Friday that I talked to Rihanna Pfefferkorn, who is a really awesome researcher out of Stanford, and we were gossiping on that Friday about something that happened with Signal. where Signal got into a bit of drama with a forensics firm called Celebrate. I think some of you remember this particular drama, where they were exchanging barbs about how one can hack the other. Celebrate is a forensic, or it's a firm that creates a forensic tool that a lot of law enforcement and government and intelligence agencies use in order to analyze and extract data from mobile phones. Well, no, from devices in general, but specifically mobile phones. And it was around this time where Celebrate very publicly and loudly announced that they had added Signal to their list of apps that, if encountered on a device, they could grab some stuff, they can grab some data from, despite Signal's claims of, like a near perfect, anonymity and security and encryption on these devices. So once again, to make sure we're perfectly clear here, what this means is that if someone physically has your device, then they could plug it into one of these machines, and then they could pull out, things like messages, contacts, etc., specifically from Signal. They can pull out data from a variety of other places on a device. Doesn't really matter. But they also added Signal as one of those things that were rife for analysis if you were using their product. And so Signal fired back. And they said, well, we got our hands on one of your devices, we analyzed your software, and we discovered that your software is wildly unsafe, has plenty of exploits, blah, 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 blah. They even threatened to release a version of Signal to the world that would essentially, in the event of encountering a Celebrate device, trigger something to destroy the Celebrate device, which is not particularly cool. At any rate, this display of, these shots fired between these two entities was amusing from a security perspective and gossipy and the bit of humor we all kind of needed. But ultimately, I would speak to a number of, this was happening even before the pandemic, but increasingly now, speak to a number of investigators who are like, I really can't, my beat is suffering because no one wants to play this game anymore. Sensitive reporting, like if you're working with national security and stuff like that, really does rely on a fair amount of trust, and usually, ideally, meeting in person is the gold standard. And so when you take this out of the equation and you're telling people, yeah, we're gonna use Signal, and then like this mishigas is going on, then there's a huge barrier to establishing trust. And so from the number of reporters that I spoke to who were working on very sensitive beats, they definitely did say that it was undeniably easier to do their work only after lockdown, to a point where, some investigations were put on hold because sources were unwilling to meet, unable to meet and unwilling to, rely on, the devices in our pocket when they're performing the act of whistleblowing. And not only were some investigations put on hold because of these limitations, a lot of them were shelved indefinitely. So there are a lot of stories out there that we might not get to hear because the connection between the source and the journalist, that initial contact could not be established because there was absolutely no trust, because trust had been relegated entirely to the digital. Some of them might come out, but one reporter did tell me that there was this caveat that a lot of these stories might no longer be relevant, people are gonna lose interest and move on, and why, even if we can pick up the story, why do it? Because nobody's gonna care anymore. Before lockdown, there was a lot of emphasis in training, and there still is. I'm not going to undermine it, but a lot of emphasis in training in journalists to be as like savvy as possible and putting together like, you know, these variety of systems in order to expedite or like to equally balance what you can do physically with sources and what you can rely upon digitally, and it's a balancing act, and it's really like an exercise in creativity. However, given the fact that everything is relegated to this digital realm, a lot of investigators I talked to, they pretty much lost a lot of confidence. And it wasn't confidence in their ability to be creative and to, you know, put together the best way to, like, you know, I don't know, to get documents from a whistleblower and put them in someplace safe in order to work on it. They were confident, but they weren't necessarily confident enough in the ability of the people that they were working with, primarily the source. One journalist I spoke to said that he wanted to resist hubris as much as possible in placing a less tech-savvy source in harm's way, because these implications are a lot broader than they were when we had the ability to be more creative between the digital and the physical. And this is a talk I did beforehand, and I'm laughing at myself because I say this a lot. It's the asymmetry of preparedness, and also and ultimately, like, this really came into relief going into lockdown, because relying on tools like WhatsApp and like Zoom and, you know, like all of the stuff that we totally took for granted, because this type of complacency breeds insecurity, became worse of an idea. There's also the being lawyered up. That is something that was less of an ability, or people had less of an ability to communicate because they did not necessarily have the ability to walk into an office and talk to someone about a problem, about a meta problem. And this is another thing, so I'm just gonna splap it up there. You've seen this a million times if you know me. This is the matrix where you think about your decision-making and which like digital platform to communicate with someone on, and people started to really, really take that to heart. Knowing that, you know, like, we have things that really, really do serve us well in having a confidential conversation for a variety of reasons, not just end-to-end encryption, but also, you know, the way that they handle things like metadata, the way that they interact with, you know, law enforcement historically, et cetera, matters a lot. However, you always have to counter that with where people are going to be available. And so, especially when, you know, doing investigations and reporting with folks in other countries who are going through conflict and other crises, talking to them on Signal is probably not going to be available to you, but you're going to have to switch to Telegram, and then all of like the digital security nightmares that unleashes. And then you start to ask yourself, if I'm not there, why am I inserting this noise into the equation when someone locally could be doing this way more safely than I can? Am I introducing more harm? So this was actually, to go back to the storytelling bit, like really, shattering to me, because I'm very fond of this matrix, but yet, instead of looking at it as like guidelines, but rather looking at it as on its inverse, as something, or as a way to kind of like measure my risk of even talking to someone when someone else might be handling this story because they can safely be there and I cannot, was a really excellent exercise in duty of care. But that said, we're going to use Signal. Okay, so this is where I give you all the cool accelerated Signal tips that we have compiled. Everybody uses Signal. Don't worry about it. So this is interesting. So in Signal, a lot of people ignore this, but you have safety numbers. And so safety numbers are the way to, attest that you are actually speaking to the person that you think you are speaking to, meaning that your communication is not being intercepted, or sometimes we like to call it man in the middle or machine in the middle, however you want to say it. It means that your communication is secure, right? Before lockdown, the best way to do it, and actually there was a lot of like engineering and design work put into the apps that you see to make this like a really cool kind of ceremony of trust, where you would walk up to someone, you would, scan a QR code that was presented in the app, and it would say, with a green check, like this safety number matches. And that's how you knew that by meeting someone in person, you could also trust them when you are away. So this is a great thing to do if you want to. There's also like, do you want, your phone to know that you've met someone in person? You have to think about that, but, that's a totally different discussion. Taking for granted that you do want this to happen, how do you do that when you can never meet in person? How do you actually trust Signal, which is the gold standard, if you can't do this basic thing, because we had our mobility taken from us? So what we told people to do is to get on the Zoom. So you might notice that when you do this, like, safety number dance, in addition to showing that QR code, you're also shown a string of numbers. And that string of numbers is the numerical representation of that QR code that you're ultimately snapping when you're in person. So if it means something to you, and you can either get on the Zoom or, any of the other, platforms that do the same thing, and look at someone in their eyes, through their camera, through an ocean, and have them read, and you and they read these numbers to one another, and they match. That actually kind of does the same thing. I can get into the minutia of it, and I'll resist doing that, but I'll tell you something in between. The best way to do it is actually to, if you want to, you look at any particular safety number set, they come in blocks of 5 characters, and those numbers represent the kind of trusted union between you and that person. And so the best way to compare these safety numbers, if you have to read these numbers out loud to one another and be sure that the other person isn't lying about it, is to go, one person says 5 numbers, the other person says another 5 numbers. Then you say 5 numbers, then the other person says 5 numbers until you're done. And that mixing of the numbers actually eliminates the possibility of lying to one another, even if you can't be in person. Okay, disappearing messages. Obviously, that's a thing. Get into the habit of turning it on immediately when you are working in investigations. How you use it in your own personal lives, it doesn't really matter. But these are, getting into the habit of turning them on immediately is really great, because you never want to be walking around town going to the grocery store and properly socially distancing with, an entire or several years of investigations in your pocket. That's just kind of common sense, but that was something that I think people should know. Group messaging exploded. I really can't even describe how many group messages I am now in over lockdown, and now it's just become my life, because and this is not only just because of lockdown, but it's also having to do with standards within in the industry for investigative teams to have a space to securely discuss investigations individually. And so I'm going to actually Shout out once again to The Intercept for lessons they've learned about how to put together a safety team for every single investigation of a certain threat model, which does require immediately, like, you know, having an individual group over Signal, and also, like, you know, having proper protocols about what you can and cannot do on that group message, which includes the turning off things like group links, which is a feature that I understand, but I don't understand why we have it. Also having a proper offboarding and or expiry of that particular group, meaning that when the editor decides that this group no longer needs to exist, you leave it. And obviously, people should have compared safety numbers, and disappearing messages are also definitely something that you want to have. Although that is up in the air because for particular reasons, perhaps compliance, perhaps, you know, for issues of liability or fact checking or whatever, you might actually not want to have disappearing messages set to, like, you know, 1 day, because that might impede an investigation in general. Administration. So this isn't pretty interesting, but just know that this is a new feature that rolled out during lockdown. Oh gosh, really? Time flies. Okay, so I'm gonna skip over that. Signal for desktop, that is something that I did want to talk about. Make sure that there's full disk encryption yet again, and also have a look at the devices that you have linked over Signal Desktop, because you never want to have a bunch of devices that you no longer control. You know what full disk encryption is? Notes to self actually are really great and are an excellent alternative to the default note-taking apps that you have on your phones, which is actually really excellent for the media makers that I had met who still went out there despite their insecurity about, you know, like the PPE that they had at their disposal, because and why it's useful is because it is fully end-to-end encrypted, unlike, you know, like the Notes app, which actually has severe limitations on what you can encrypt. Okay, we can talk about your privacy here. But I do want to, as you observe this slide, talk about like notifications, where you definitely don't want to get yourself into a scenario where, regardless of like all the work you did to lock down your particular phone, you receive a bubble while your phone is locked on a table, and it pretty much displays all of the contents of your messages. And another thing, especially since everyone is crazy about Pegasus, and we definitely do know that not only is Pegasus the name of one of a variety of tools that do the same thing, and so there's so much out there that we do not know. We do know that one vector is, you know, unsolicited media, one particularly pernicious vector. And so if you're concerned about unsolicited media coming into your phone, then use the auto download options, which are actually for data saving, in order to prevent that from happening, and only like download and look at images and videos from people that you can trust. Registration lock and your phone numbers. Okay, here's another Friday. I'm going to talk about collaborative solutions because it's not only about source communication, it's also about you know, how you communicate within an investigative unit. And so one thing that we did was just talk about, like, you know, self-hosted solutions that could, if you were brave enough to do so, make sure that you were no longer reliant on these platforms. So I'm going to shout out really quickly CryptPad as a great alternative to Google Docs with the collaborative editing. All of these are self-hosted. Nextcloud. Oh, well, this is a self-hosted option. Yes, but yes, we could talk about that later. Nextcloud, which is great for a alternative to Drive and Calendar and all sorts of Google Suite stuff. We love Jitsi still, and self-hosting and so many security configurations that make it even more powerful than Zoom. For large media operations, people working in the media space, doing unsafe things like, oh God, remote desktop, when you have to when you're in separate editing suites across the globe and you literally have to work on a feature together, recommending a protocol called WireGuard as a VPN to connect people or to gain access to shared assets, and then wrapping that all under a protocol called Tailscale. But caveats galore, because it's not for the faint at heart. So here we are today. And I have a lot of nightmares, but I also have a lot of daydreams. My nightmares are actually about the metadata trail that we have left. It has grown exponentially if you think about how everything that you used to do physically has now taken place over Zoom and other platforms, and all of that metadata is in their hands. And as that data finds its way into their hands, that archive can find its way into law enforcement's hands. I think that this will, I can't wait to see what happens. I mean, it'll suck, but it'll be very interesting. Before the pandemic, our press freedom tracker, definitely picked up on stuff like subpoenas and legal orders, which wasn't looking great because this was the Trump era and they were really into that. But then if you look at the time period between, that day I first experienced lockdown and the Biden inauguration, we had 19 incidents of, just kind of petty, easy grabs at this type of data. And and so I do want us to think about, it's not the Biden administration is going to make it better, but this is already out there and it's dangerous enough. But on the right side, I do daydream about the fact that we learned a lot about hybrid working as far as putting together really good whistleblower-based investigations. And now combined with the confidence to be together in public, I think we're this is going to become an amazingly interesting industry. And also, finally, what we've proven is that we can actually make media, we can save media outlets outside of the coasts with tactics like these. Why does news have to break in New York, Washington, LA? Why? Why does that have to happen? You can use these same tactics in a newsroom in Tennessee and save journalism there. So that's it. I don't take questions. Thanks to my friends, Kirsten, who's watching, and all the rest. And that's me.